are facing certain difficulties in reaching one of our panelists, but we will start the session immediately and hopefully she will be able to join in soon. My name is Nimisha Narona and I'm your moderator for today's panel. The Human Rights Society aims to facilitate dialogue and research in the pursuit of achieving substantive change. Women have participated and led multiple movements across the globe, but their contribution is often erased, discounted, or ignored. Their participation has stood as a proclamation of their autonomy, resilience, a symbol of reclaiming their agency, and staunch rebellion against oppressive patriarchal attitudes. Having women is especially important for the success of a protest and a movement, according to research done by Harvard professor Erica Chenoweth. Today, we are going to delve into a wonderful discussion on the impact of women in protests as the final culmination of the Society's Conference on Democracy, Dissent, and Justice in India. We are delighted to be joined by an exceptional and distinguished set of panelists, starting with Professor Dr. Soumya Uma, who is an associate professor at Jindal Global Law School, holds a BA LLB honors from NLSIU, 2 postgraduate law degrees, and has completed her doctoral research. She has work experience as an academic, law researcher, lawyer, trainer, writer, and campaigner. She has worked with several international and national agencies, and her work and multiple research publications and books center around feminist jurisprudence, victims, international criminal justice, South Asian women's movements, and human rights, amongst others. Pamela Philippos is an esteemed Indian journalist with extensive experience and researcher who is a senior fellow at the Indian Council of Social Science Research. She is also currently the public editor of The Wire. She has authored several commentary pieces and is working on social media and social movements. Dentist, film student, and now activist, Navkiran Nath is a name we have been hearing often recently. She has donned many hats at a young age and is at the center of the farmers' protests at Tikri. She runs a makeshift library there and is part of the editorial team of the famous Trolley Times, the protest's very own newspaper. To give everyone a brief idea of the format, we will start off the panel with questions to the panelists. Although the questions are initially directed specifically, the others should feel free to jump in and continue the conversation, as we would love to hear all your perspectives. Towards the end of the session, we will keep a 15-minute window for the audience questions. So please feel free to input your questions in the chat box throughout. They will be filtered and asked towards the end. To start off the session, we would like to understand and locate the impact of the women's movement. And I would like to invite Dr. Soumya to get us started by elaborating on the historical origins of women's participation in protests, its contemporary significance, and how these movements united myriad women across borders and inspired transnational solidarity and cooperation that deeply affects the politics and women of today's age. Dr. Soumya, if you could go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Nimisha. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, okay. So thank you to the Human Rights Society. I think this is a commendable initiative over the last 2 days of speaking about dissent and human rights, very, very important topics in today's context. Thank you, Nimisha, for that very generous introduction. So let me start with, with a question or an issue that you have requested me to talk about, and there are a few parts to it. You've asked me to, briefly talk about the historical origins of women's participation. But before I do that, because we keep talking about feminism and women's movements quite often, I thought I would just start with clarifying that feminisms are ideologies related to countering patriarchy, ending sexism, sex-based discrimination, and ensuring women's equality rights on various issues and spheres. And women's movements use those feminist ideologies, and they are a series of political campaigns for reforms in law and policy. And protests are a tool or campaign strategy for this. And it could be for demanding enactment of a law or policy. It could be for demanding a repeal or an amendment to a law or policy. It could be for a proper implementation of a law or policy. It could be for demanding accountability of perpetrators of violation of women's rights. And it could be both in terms of acts of commission and omission, both by state actors as well as non-state actors. And it could even be about opposing a judgment which has been evidently biased or unfair, like the Mathura rape case in the 1970s. Now, it is difficult to actually talk about the historical origins of women's participation because in protests, because I think women have been protesting since time immemorial. Wherever there has been injustice, women have been protesting. Wherever there has been patriarchy and patriarchal processes, there have been women protesting that and questioning that. But in terms of documented protests, I think it's been only in the last couple of centuries, maybe from the late 1700s, but much more documentation in the 1800s and thereabouts. And there again, we can see that the protests have been simultaneous as parts of women's movements all over the world. In US, for example, we could look at, Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 as one such milestone with, and also with, Sojourner Truth asking, ain't I a woman in 1851 about the exclusion both of women and of African American women. But if you look at UK, for example, there was the suffragette movement. In Russia, women were in the forefront, and they led to the overthrow of the Tsar in early 1900s. In India, we had the social reform movement. French Revolution as well. There were many thousands of women who took part in it. So I think it was, I would say that every country has a history of documented women's participation in protests and politics. Origin is from time immemorial, and where there has been injustice, women have protested, and that is everywhere. So that's my response to the first part of your question. Do you want me to speak about the contemporary significance of those movements?
Yes, I would love if you would want to elaborate further.
Oh, sure. Okay, so if we just take up a few of these protests, of these recent protests, and by contemporary protests, I'm talking about last few years. So if we look at Chile, for example, and the whole feminist performance piece, The Rapist Is You, protesting violence against women, it originated in Chile, and then it was performed in various parts of Latin America, US, Europe, Asia, including India. And why is it being replicated everywhere? Because women are able to connect to it. They are able to connect with the violations they have faced. They are able to connect to the impunity for violence against women that the song talks about. The complicity of the police, the parliamentarians, the judges. If we take Argentina, strict rules for against abortion because of religious grounds, and there were protests for abortion rights by women, and very significantly they were supported by their male family members and friends. And in December 2020, we had this situation of legalized abortion and improving reproductive rights and healthcare. If we look at US, we have the Black Lives Matter, where again, many women have been at the forefront. If we take South Africa, again, many women have protested, especially in 2019, for the rising violence against women and government inaction. In Thailand, And in Hong Kong, women have been at the forefront of pro-democracy protests. In Myanmar, pro-democracy protesters have also been women, and they have used a very, very unique kind of a campaign strategy, where they have hung women's clothing across the roads, and police is seen taking them down before passing by to control the mob, because there is a superstition that men cannot walk under the women's clothing. So they have used very, very creative kind of campaigns. If we see Pakistan, just this month, as part of the International Women's Day celebrations, women protested against what they call the patriarchy pandemic. So they were wearing masks, they maintained physical distance. At the same time, they also danced, they also sang, they celebrated solidarity, they celebrated feminist sisterhood, but it was also for a collective purpose. It was also a protest against various forms of harassment, violence against women, increase in healthcare, access to even vaccination, subsidized menstrual products, access to contraception. And in Nepal, women have protested, this is again this month, women have protested a proposed immigration rule that says that women under the age of 40, if they have to travel outside Nepal, they need the family approval. So we see that women have been on the streets, and I'm not talking about India, because I think the other speakers will be also speaking about India. But I think women all over the world, they are out on the streets. They are countering notion that public spaces are to be occupied only by men, and women's place is in the home. Women are also giving visibility to their lived realities and the violence and the discrimination that they face. But they are not doing only that. They are also active campaigners for larger political campaigns like democracy, accountability, justice, and so on. So over and above their immediate concerns as well, women have been in the protests. If we look at transnational feminist solidarity, which is the other part which you asked, Nimisha, I think women, there's been a lot of solidarity across the borders. It's not just a country's women's movement. Of course, there's been very concerted protests, campaigns, movements in most of the countries, but there has also been the cross-border cooperation. I just want to give a few examples of this. For example, in 1998, when there was the Rome Conference, which established the International Criminal Court, we actually had a women's caucus which was formed, and which included women's rights activists all over the world, bringing in ground level experiences. Why was this important? And I'm also speaking from my own personal experience of being part of this women's caucus, being part of this strategy group, which was working to make sure that the statute and the rules of evidence and procedure and all of that, they were not gender blind, and they address the specific crimes of women that are committed all over the world, which are often brushed under the carpet using reasons such as culture, religion, customs, and so on. So that's one example of feminist, transnational feminist solidarity. Another example is the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's military sexual slavery. And in 2000, there was this Tokyo Tribunal, which was held in Tokyo, where women from all over the world came together to protest against the forcible sexual slavery of women and girls from Malaysia, Korea, Philippines, China, Taiwan, and so on. And there were women who were these former, what is euphemistically referred to as comfort women, and they were breaking the silence and talking about the wrongs done to them, asking the Japanese government for a public apology, and women all over the world supported that demand. In Bangladesh, similarly, There has been a demand for an official apology from Pakistan. Vienna Conference, Beijing Conference, 1 billion rising. So these have all been, many examples of transnational feminist solidarity and women's movements and protests coming together from across the borders. And what have they achieved? One is drawing the attention of global community to the lived realities of women. Second, they have set new normative standards for states to adhere to. And thirdly, they have compelled accountability of perpetrators for reparative justice of women. So women's movements within India and transnational women's movements work together to realize women's equality rights. That's what I believe in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soumya, for that very interesting perspective and firmly grounding us in where this discussion is going. At this moment, I would like to ask any of the other panelists if they have anything to say or input on any of Dr. Soumya's points. Okay, if nobody has anything to add, I would just like to take a minute. We have Advocate Flavia who has joined in now. So I'd like to take a minute to introduce her. Advocate Flavia is a pioneer of legal reform and the co-founder of Majlis. She's deeply involved at the forefront of the women's movement, and her work centers around domestic violence, sexual violence, minority law reform, secularism, and human rights in her many publications and her extensive efforts to reform personal law. So I would just like to welcome her to the panel discussion. And I would like to ask a question to her. Also, if the panelists could keep their cameras on throughout and engage with each other, that would be lovely, because we would love to see you all have a conversation with each other. So Advocate Flavia, in your article on redefining the women's movement within a secular framework, you talked about the role that women's protests have played in the communal agenda. Could you please enlighten us on how women's protests have sometimes been used to further regressive agendas, with the recent examples that we have seen in Delhi, where there was a sit-in of women who sat in direct opposition to the women protesting at Shaheen Bagh? In the increasingly communal atmosphere that we are facing in today's nation, how do you view the current protests in light of your prior observations, and what should we do to dismantle it? Advocate Flavia, if you could.
Just a minute. You can't see me, right? One second. I have to put the camera on. Just give me a minute. Yeah.
No worries.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you are audible.
And can you see me?
No, we got you for a minute there, but we've lost you again.
Oh, okay, 1 second. I'll just try to get myself. 1 second, I'll just see this. I don't know what's happened here. 1 second. Can I just start speaking, because
for sure, no worries.
You can't see me, I guess. Okay, redefining the women's movement in the context of the communal riots in 1992-93, after the demolition of the Babri Masjid. This article was published soon after the demolition, and there were riots in Bombay and in other cities. Now, till then, I'm glad you've chosen this particular essay to talk about, because this goes a little away from my usual writings, because it is written from within the women's movement. And in 1992-93, we did not discuss communalism. We did not have secularism as a clear agenda. What we discussed was oppression of women, domestic violence, sexual violence, etc. But the riots in Bombay was an eye-opener for many of us, where the slogan, "We are one, hum sab ek hai," fell flat because women got divided across the communal binary. And there were a lot of women belonging to various political parties, grassroots workers, etc., who took part in the riots against Muslims. And that came as a shock to us, and not just like violence, but it was a brutal violence against Muslim community, including throwing stones when men are being lit on fire and burnt. And this did not happen too far away from where our office was. In fact, it was within the vicinity of our office then. And this was a major shock that it broke many myths for us, that women are not violent. There is bonding between women across all kinds of divisions. And there is this unity of women, which will strengthen each other. But if you see here, women were more aligned to the party ideology, and where there was nothing bonding between women across the divide, political divide or the communal divide. So that made us realize, at least made some of us realize, that we need to have an analysis which is much sharper than what we used to have, that we are all women and we experience violence in a similar manner. That this is not so. Women experience violence in a very different ways, as for the caste, as for the community, as for their class position, various things. After that, we had Kairanji, the Dalit women's issue, and how Dalit women were violated and burned. And women from the upper caste supported this. So these were incidents which made us realize, and more recently we have the Hathras case, what happened over there, and the support, the Thakurs, the upper caste people all gathered together against this girl and a family who belonged to the lower caste. So this is something which is very upsetting, and hence I wrote that piece to say we need to work harder, we need to have a more nuanced perspective, which would include the women's movement, which challenges for patriarchy and which analyzes and tries to understand the different layers of patriarchy, which is not sufficient. We need to have a lens which is multi-focused, where we are looking at caste, where we are looking at community, we are looking at minoritism, and we then experience it many, many ways. If you see this NRC thing, if you see the Citizens Amendment Act, CAA, various things, you can see that women of a particular community, like in this case of CAA, it is the Muslim women who were protesting. And if you see the NRC issue, again, as a community, they were being attacked, and not just as women. Similarly, in the 2002 Gujarat riots, for instance, women were constantly attacked because they were sexually violated, not just because they are women, but they are Muslim women. So these kind of situations have made us realize that we need to, like, in order to build a framework of nonviolence, we need to understand secularism, we need to understand communal tendencies, and we need to have challenge patriarchy all at the same time. We cannot challenge patriarchy alone and not have this multiple lens through which we look at the violence of violence by women of the upper caste against women of the lower caste. So, and now we know the different aspects that are coming up again and again and again in different contexts. So while we belong to a particular community or particular class position or in the caste hierarchy, we are placed at a higher level. We need to, while we challenge patriarchy, we also need to understand the privileges that we have by belonging to this particular upper caste or this particular privileged class position. So, and then we need to like come out of these barriers and have a solidarity with women across globe who are marginalized, who are oppressed, who are going through different kinds of violence and humiliation. And we need to like identify with them. If you see in the Delhi CAA protest, you will see a lot of Muslim women of different ages and different different communities, different ages, all of that. But you also had a lot of students, the student community coming and joining them. So that, according to me, was an indication that these kind of alliances are possible, and we need to have these alliances, and we cannot just look at this issue only as Muslim women's issue or the issue concerning Muslim community. But each of us have to challenge our own positions and move out of our comfort zones, and then work towards gender equality at different levels. We cannot be comfortably saying that, you know, yeah, we are all together while challenging patriarchy, but on other issues we are not together. We need to have that solidarity across these boundaries and strengthen these movements for equality, these movements for gender justice, these movements for secularism. It is in this context that I wrote that particular piece, which was not very popular when I wrote it at that time. In fact, there was a lot of discomfort among many of my own friends and colleagues at the time, that we are all together in this struggle against patriarchy. So why this article? But then later on, many of my friends and colleagues realized the context of this article and the relevance of this article. And that article got published in like 2-3 volumes on the Bombay riots, etc. So I'm very glad that time, and I felt very strongly at the time to write that article and get it published, because it gives a view of something that we had held very dear since the 1980s, since we joined the movement, the women's movement started. So here somewhere we were assigned to like have a wedge within that so-called solidarity of feminists who challenge patriarchy. So, and for Majlis, it became very important. The name itself, Majlis, gives an indication that it's just not women's struggle, but it focuses on broader struggles. We got registered in 1991, but immediately the following year, the riots happened in Bombay. So we felt that it was very apt that we had given this name Majlis, which doesn't identify, it's not rooted in Urdu, it's not rooted in Sanskrit or because at many points we were asked, why did you not name Sashakti or various such names? Why did you say Majlis? And Majlis is a Muslim word. And we always explained that word doesn't have a religion. The word is an indication, and it is used in many different contexts. So we are using Majlis to make ourselves broader. We're working on women, we're working on secularism, and there may be other aspects that we need to struggle against. So Majlis is a very broad term. And in fact, in the early days, like 93, 94, 95, we had a lot of problem establishing that we are secular. Because people used to think that we are Muslim, we are fundamentalist, all of these. So somewhere within Majlis, this ideology is deeply ingrained that we need to look at issues beyond the lens of patriarchy. We have to look at issues within a lens of multiple identities of women that go, and where sometimes women can be pitted against each other. That lesson came to us during the Bombay riots. And over the years, this was 92, 93. Over the years, if you see in the later 90s, and then the first decade of the millennium, the second decade of the millennium, you can see this thing flaring up in various other contexts. So I really wish that we develop a philosophy, we develop an understanding which is much sharper, much finer, to understand the various kinds of oppression that women at the margins go through. And that according to me, was why this article was written at that point of time. Thank you so much for asking this.
Thank you so much for expanding upon that. And I think it's a very pertinent point in today's day and age, where we all need to realize that though we are bound by oppression as women, we have to acknowledge our own privilege in the levels of that hierarchy. And I would like to invite, if any of the other panelists want to unmute themselves and build on that, please feel free to do so. All right, and then building on that, Pamela ma'am, you as a journalist have closely observed and studied the various facets of protests over the years. And I want to build on what Flavia ma'am was saying and ask you how you have observed the media narrative change and its response to women in protests, especially when we see media coverage with regards to the women in Shaheen Bagh versus the media coverage with regards to the women in the farmers' protest, and how this has manifested itself, and what role does the media play in changing that perception and in giving women that platform? You have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me, Nimisha?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. Thank you to the Human Rights Society, to Nimisha, to Soumya, Karthika, as well as Flavia. Thank you, Flavia, for that wonderful presentation, and Navkiran, who I'm looking forward to hear. I didn't really have a very clear brief, so much of what I'm going to say covers the same track that the other two speakers have covered. But anyway, with my own little twist, perhaps. Sara Ahmed, in her book, Living a Feminist Life, draws on bell hooks' definition of feminism as a movement to end sexism, sexual exploitation, and sexual oppression. Feminism is necessary because of what has not ended. And for Hooks, this definition cannot be separated from racism. And in our case, as Flavia highlighted, from communalism. In the days when I first saw myself as a feminist, the term intersectionality had not made it to our vocabulary. It took 3 more decades before that happened, but there was an unstated internalization of the idea of intersectionality, in the sense that women's groups were among the most articulate social forces in all social political activism in the post-emergency period. The central concern was sexual violence, perhaps because it was an emphatic marker of unequal relations between genders. But caste violence, communal assaults, population control measures, which were very big in those days, sex ratio and its impacts, hunger concerns, environmentalism, and struggle for the commons, including land rights. These were all part of what our activism in the old days meant. Certain moments of clarity illumined the course of the women's movement, and dissent was embedded in it. To change the status quo, you had to first dissent with the status quoists. We have to craft arguments against them and take those arguments to far corners. In the 70s, there was a Status of Women Committee report towards equality, which marked a remarkable discursive shift. and provided a theoretical base to the activism of what is known as a second wave feminism. It explicitly recognized, and I open quotes, large masses of women in this country have remained unaffected by the rights guaranteed to them by the Constitution. Later in that decade, we had the open letter to the Supreme Court, and many of you are familiar with it, written by 4 law professors who directly confronted the judge who had delivered the Mathura rape verdict. Your Lordship, does the Indian Supreme Court expect a young girl, when trapped by 2 policemen inside a police station, to successfully raise alarm for help? The question of personal agency and consent was flagged for the first time in that articulation. The 80s is recognized today as a significant decade for the Indian feminist movement. It began on an emphatic note. I was in Bombay, and Flavia was there too, when the Forum Against Rape, later renamed as a Forum Against Oppression, engendered on the fighting streets of the city, was formally inaugurated in February 1980. I remember the excitement of that moment. Ahilya Rangnekar, the grand old communist woman leader, spoke on the occasion, as did Indira Jaisingh, a prominent feminist lawyer. Vijay Tendulkar, one of Marathi literature's finest and socially aware minds, hailed the brave women who were ushering in a revolution. Activism took wing, and no part of India was untouched by it, from the Chipko movement in the high Himalaya to the fisher women of Nagarcoil. So what made the onset of the 21st century different for the activism, including feminist activism? The most decisive turning point was not located in the feminist movement, but in the political economy. As the 90s unfolded, however, it became increasingly clear that the conscious strategic change that was being attempted to rupture the idea of the Nehruvian consensus. The economic restructuring and globalization of the early 90s achieved a political consensus and saw the rise of a new middle class. It is possible to define this newness in several ways. Leela Fernandez has argued that the rise of this class represents the political construction of a social group that operated as a proponent of economic liberalization. Among the sweeping transformations brought about by the 2 forces of globalization and economic liberalization in India was the mushrooming of media establishments and products. John B. Thompson has argued that symbolic forms or symbolic systems like the media are not ideological in themselves, and that whether or not they are ideological is dependent on the ways they are used and understood in specific social contexts. We must keep this in mind when we see the ways in which media was used to create consumers in consumers. They create in consumers an ownership of the values of marketization and globalization. The market found use for women's rights, as also the media. Maitreyi Chaudhary, after studying the content of women's magazines between 1993 and 2000, noted that much of the material that passed for independent features were actually promoting, even sponsoring various products available in the market. Women's Day came to be celebrated as liberation for women to acquire sleek gadgets that often led them right back into the home and kitchen. This reordering of familiar tropes in the name of progress and modernity did little to usher in social equality between the genders. Was there something potentially liberatory about this parallel proliferation of the new middle class and the media? It could be argued that these forces did unleash a self-liberatory moment. Questions of sexuality, never discussed before, now figured in the media and public sphere. It allowed a freedom to problematize the body, to reject what Judith Butler termed as the heterosexual matrix. By the second decade of the 21st century, there's a realization that the times demanded a new grammar of cultural production. And remember, by the second decade, we had gone through all those terrible experiences, including the 2002 Gujarat riots, the issues that both Soumya and Flavia have flagged. But the protests that followed the Nirbhaya gang rape of Delhi 2012 provided evidence of a new grammar of cultural production. And when I say cultural production, it includes media production. Pitted against a cry for retribution to avenge the violation of the good woman was a parallel articulation by feminists for justice for all women. A powerful instance of this was a protest speech made outside the residence of Delhi Chief Minister Sheila Dikshit on December 12th, December 19th that year, by Kavita Krishnan, responding to an observation made by the Chief Minister that women should not be adventurous. Krishnan declaimed, "We will be adventurous, we will be reckless, we will be rash, we will do nothing for our safety. Don't you dare tell us how to dress, when to go out at night, in the day, or how to walk, or how many escorts we need. Even if women walk out on the streets alone, even if it is late at night, why should justifications be provided? Freedom without fear is what we need." And this was an argument, remember, at a time when people were talking of many BJP politicians, for instance, was talking about the need for protection, for protecting our women by extending, Rakis and so on. Sushma Swaraj characterized it as Zinda Lash, the struggle, the body of an assaulted woman, as Zinda Lash. So, I mean, these were things that needed a different parameter to judge. And the speech that Kavita delivered went viral on YouTube. And her Facebook inbox was overflowing with messages of thanks from young women, not from Delhi or Bombay or other metros, but from small towns across the country. Krishnan later recalled, "I then realized I had struck a chord and that there were hundreds of women in the country who longed for someone to speak for their freedoms." Such expressions of independence were apparent in digital campaigns that had been mounted to challenge patriarchal assumptions even earlier. I don't know if you remember the Pink Chaddi protest of 2009 or the Besharmi Morcha of 2011. These were in response to fundamentalist Hindutva forces who wanted women to stay within the four corners of the house. But these movements drew support not just from metropolitan centers, but interestingly also from even rural areas. What was being attempted was a systematic countering of the socially constructed image of the Indian woman, the so-called Bharatiya Nari, weighed down by tradition. And doing this by deliberately adopting stances designed to outrage conservative sentiments and iterate the right to sexual freedom and desire. The gang rape protests witnessed creative forms of cultural dissent to dismantle the shame honor paradigm that invariably marked public responses to assaults on women. Facebook pages and Twitter feeds were harnessed to convey information that ranged from advice on how to negotiate the city safely to incisive, even humorous critiques of the hypocritical stances of religious leaders and politicians. In subsequent years, the online space became the site for a new protean feminist militancy. The international Me Too campaign, triggered off by the sexual harassment conduct of influential Bollywood producer Harvey Weinstein in 2017, had its resonance in India, even in rural corners, as his remarkable letter put out by the newspaper Khabar Lahariya. I hope some of you are familiar with this remarkable effort brought out by women in Bundelkhand. And they said, power works differently in our mohallas and gullies and chorahas. We live tightly bound to community structures. You are often our distant relatives, neighbors, watchdogs with deep interest in keeping us bound. Yet, despite the close distances and with little knowledge of other women in other places or the power of a hashtag, we have spoken and acted using our voice and the broken tools of law. They're saying this to the men in their society. It's an amazing letter. We see here a unique form of dissent that in a way ties the themes that we were exploring in this conversation. The movements may vary. We saw, for instance, the car struggle and the Muslim women who came out day and night in remarkable ways. I participated in some of those protests, and the energy was something to be believed. Today, we have the mobilization of women farmers in support of farmer protests at the gates of Delhi. I was there at Tikri border for Women's Day, and it was something to be seen again. These women wanted the repeal of the 3 black farm laws, but they also want to be recognized as farmers in their own right, given their years of toil in the fields across the country. This is, in a sense, double dissent. There's a broader dissent of the farm protests, and within it, the dissent for recognition by women farmers. There's a great deal to say, but I will end here, and I'm sure Navkiran can also join in and tell us a lot more. And I will end here, Nimisha, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for taking us through all of that and all those interesting perspectives from how consumerism played into sort of the liberation, as well as what they're marketing like a facade of liberalization. And I think it still persists to today. And then bringing it all the way till now to the farmers' protest, where Navkiran is right now. So, and how you said when you brought up Kavita's speech, and how that is still pertinent today, because it's always a speech about protecting women and never making the atmosphere safe enough for us to go out. We shouldn't have to be protected. So I'm going to bring Navkiran in, but before I do that, I also wanted to point out when you were talking about autonomy, the Chief Justice's remarks of telling the women at the borders to go back. Again, it was a blatant rejection of their identity as farmers, let alone women, because there was no recognition of their work and the effort that they put in. It's just a blatant remark that showcases women's invisible labor, even now, even from one of the highest institutions in our country. So Navkiran, as an active participant in these protests, responsible for so many remarkable initiatives that we have seen on social media through through Trolley Times, where we've read so many remarkable stories of women from the ground. I want to bring you in and ask, what changes do you see when women enter the protest site, and what are the tactics they employ? And also, what challenges do you face and do they face when we're mobilizing women from lower caste, lower income households who are bound by other circumstances, when it's usually their rights being affected the most? So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Thank you, Nimisha, for the lovely introduction and also for having me here today. So, historically, women's labor has not been recognized in any sphere, whether domestic, workspace, or in public. The galaxy of outstanding women in these spaces has broken many barriers and paved a way to snatch their due recognition, but the social structure has at most remembered them as exceptions. There is no material ground to do so besides patriarchal bias, which always looks at them as an exception. The women, unlike coming to these farmer agitation, the women make up more than half of the agrarian workforce. And if we include animal husbandry or the domestic labor they do for the agrarian workers or the workers who work on the fields during the peak seasons, they outnumber men in significant numbers, because I myself have seen the women making 150 or 200 rotis at one time for the people who are working on the fields. And we never, I'm like, nobody ever recognized that domestic labor as agrarian labor. And it's not just about the women who are directly involved in the farming. What about the women who are, let's say, not from farming families? In Indian households, running the kitchen has been a woman's job, and the Essential Commodities Act, which is one of the three laws farmers are opposing, along with increasing fuel prices, endanger the already squeezed budget of the majority of the people. It's not just a question of short or prolonged inflation, but of deregulation, hence freeing the government from any possible political or, to be precise, electoral repercussion. This altogether makes a case that everyone is going to be affected invariably by these laws, and social structure goes, women will have to shoulder the bigger share of this burden, even in non-farming families. So, like landless laborers and workers, women are also present in large numbers in the protests, but even more of them are back home, taking care of the everyday work at home and in the fields. So that unfortunately, relatively more men could be at the protest side. Their absence has to be read structurally, not merely by number there. Even their absence is facilitating the mobilization. It is not an endorsement, but acceptance of rather sad reality. Because, like, I'm also an activist, student youth activist from last 12, 13 years. And other than that, both my parents are activists. And I've seen many farmer agitations, movements in the past with my parents. So I've never witnessed this huge women participation in any of the farmers movement in the past. So in that way, this is something really new. And I guess in a way, the gender movements which we witnessed, or the women movements which we witnessed globally in the past few years, also one reason for that how women are more assertive now, how they are like coming on the roads, and like Pamela said, the women who are present on the protest sites, they are not like opposing these three farm laws, but they are also asserting their share or their labor in the farming sector or in the agriculture. So I think that's really new. And there I would like to mention one particular example where I interviewed one Muslim woman, Muslim lower caste woman, who was from a landless family. Her name was Akbari. So Akbari walked for 11 days along with her husband from Bathinda, Punjab, to Tikri border, like just in the solidarity of the struggling farmers. And when I asked her, because I was interviewing her for the Trolley Times, when I asked her that you don't have any land, then why are you here? Akbari said that when the land is taken over by the corporates, their dream of owning land will also be snatched. So, I mean, like, even they are aware that their struggle won't end by winning this movement or by government repealing these three laws. They know what they really want. And as like Pamela mentioned earlier, even because I was also there on 8th March at Tikri's main stage, women asserted again and again that they are not secondary protesters. They are not on the protest sites because they are someone's mother, sister, or like I'm like relative of the male farmers or the male protesters. They are there because I'm like they are also farmers. So that claim of being a primary protester is what they are like claiming again and again from the stages while like addressing the media and in each and every way. And also the initiatives they took in the protest, because earlier I still remember during the earlier few days of these protests, media was only showing women making rotis. And it was quite disturbing for me because I'm on the protest side from day one. I was like, I had one dabba in my hand and I was painting the walls. I was doing slogan writing. I was writing slogans on the tractors and trolleys, and many women were volunteering there. Women were like on the main stage as leaders, and media was showing them just making rotis. So I'm like, with time, media also felt their mistake and changed that narrative. Now we can see women in the leadership. They are volunteering. They are taking care of the logistics. They are helping in the langar. They are running libraries, printing newspapers, newsletters, and I'm like, they are doing all the. They are taking all the initiatives. So and also, I guess there are other equations which are changing on the TICRI borders. Like there are many everyday activities that we see that gives us glimpses of gender equality, gender equal futures. Men cooking is a rare thing, but even rarer is their conversation about it, that even momentary recognize the domestic labor and their empathy towards it. And as I said earlier, I mean, during the initial days when I was writing slogans, one day I felt hungry and I went to a group of young men who were making rotis. And I told them that I'm feeling hungry. Can you feed me? They said, yeah, of course. And there were like group of 4 or 5 young men who were like making rotis. And at the same time, they were talking about, to each other about rotis. And one young fellow, say 21, 20-year-old, he turned to me and said, Didi, the day I came here, I didn't even know how to make roti. And see, now my rotis are like really good. I was like, okay, yeah. And there was another person who said, I used to go home at odd times and wake up my sleeping wife to demand that she make a meal for 5. He said it didn't seem hard then, but now when I'm making meal for 5, now I know how hard it is. So the way they are like realizing, they are recognizing that domestic labor is also like something this movement is giving us. And I think because I myself come from the same region. I'm from Punjab. So I brought up in Punjab. So I mean, like, for that society, this is something really new. And I mean, this protest in that way is going to give us many socio-cultural changes in that sense. And also when I mean, like, even you mentioned that incident when the Chief Justice of India remarked on Women's Day, on not Women's Day, on women being kept at protest sites. It was just a brute reminder of patriarchy, which resonates equally from a faraway countryside field to the very Supreme Court. The temporary settlements at different protest sites tell a story the patriarchy has afraid to hear and see. Women's presence there in leadership, in logistics, in mobilization, in singing and sloganeering, in addressing media, running libraries and schools, and producing newsletters, but not with the needs. The women refuse to be an exception here. I mean, like, that's the story that rattles the status quo of these institutions. And I guess that's something which this movement is giving to us. And the movement, I mean, these movements are also an important juncture to also recognize the people who have been silently fighting for people's rights when no media or common people were around to see them and support them, except state hounding them. I'm like, when I'm saying recognize these people, means the women leaders or the women activists, say Navdeep Kaur. I mean, like, she was organizing the workers in the Kundli industrial area when this movement wasn't reached at the Kundli protest site. And say women leaders like Jasbir Kaur. So just a small disclaimer here, Jasbir Kaur Nath is my mother, and she's the only woman in Sanyukt Committee Morcha at Tikri. She went to jail 5 times, and and like in a way, she never got that recognition as a farmer leader earlier. Say Harinder Bindu, the women leader from BKU Graha, and there are many other women who got that recognition as farmer leaders. So I guess these movements are also important from in that sense. It has to become part of our consciousness to recognize these battles that slowly build bigger movements. And I guess, I mean, beyond this, I have been at the protests since day one, and along with few young people, we started newsletter Trolley Times, which I also mentioned earlier. And that has established itself as one of the most reliable sources of ground reporting and update about the movement across the world. Even our editorial team has always made sure that the intersectionality of the participants is reflected in our coverage, whether it's gender, caste, class, or region. In a way, women are not waiting for a platform, but creating platforms, not for self, but for the whole movement. They are not separate from the movement. Actually, they are the movement. So this movement is giving us a historic opportunity to recognize women farmers, a long due demand. And if a mass movement such as this can achieve this successfully, it can be emulated in other spheres as well, which is what I think. Also, this movement seeks to recognize the gender disparity in domestic and farming labor with a dual strategy of equal work distribution, equal pay, and land rights, as well as the due recognition. Because as I mentioned earlier, the nearly 50% agrarian workforce is women, but only 2% women are landholders. So I guess if the movement demands this sincerely, then yes, it is a revolution in making. So I guess I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very personal and inspiring account of the things that are happening on the ground. And I think it's important for us to remember how you brought up how your own mother, her name wasn't ever mentioned, and how you felt sort of similarly the same way in the beginning when they were just covering women making the rotis at the protest sites, and how that hasn't really changed from the time she was protesting to now. But also how you brought out that the protest is not just about the farmers, and it's permeating through our social consciousness and bringing about change, whether it's about distribution of labor at the home, whether it's men making rotis for you. And speaking of that, I read an article about you just yesterday where you had mentioned somewhere in it where you were sort of thrown off by the assumption in the initial days by some people that you were going to make the rotis, even though you would happily do it. But why was the assumption that it was your job to do it? And I think that builds into a lot of the conversations that we're having and how it achieves change, and how Professor Soumya initially brought up how dissent is the first step. Dissent is the first step through reclaiming our agency, for minority women to reclaim their agency and move forth from them. If any of the other panelists would like to build on what Navkiran ma'am just said, please feel free to unmute. Dr. Soumya, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I'm not sure whether I'm muted or unmuted.
You're audible, you're audible.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Navkiran. There was just something that you said about, gender equal futures. When you talked about what's happening in these farmers' protests, that also resonated with me in terms of what was happening in Shaheen Bagh and the changed or changing gender roles, with women out on the streets protesting, men taking care of the household. So, somewhere that also resonated in terms of possible gender equal futures. But one of the other things which Pamela had talked, and in her very interesting talk, one of the last things, Pamela, that you mentioned was about this double descent. And I thought that's really interesting. And I kind of, I was reading about these pro-democracy protests in Thailand, where there are these young women who are in the forefront. And, they are, of course, demanding democracy and protesting against so many authoritarian rules. But they are also making use of that opportunity to question certain patriarchal norms, which have become very, very, it's been embedded as part of Thai culture, and they are questioning all that. So again, you see these double descent there, in the phrase that you used. I thought that was really interesting. The other thought that came to my mind, and I'm going back to what Navkiran talked about, this changed gender roles through the protest, was when I've read about these, nationalist struggles and the role of women during those nationalist struggles, where, in India, where the women came out on the streets, they responded to Gandhiji's call and all of that. So they took part in salt satyagraha, in all the civil disobedience movements, strikes, and all of that, demonstrations. And then when we got freedom, they were asked to go back to the houses, and because now your place is the home. And women resisted because they had seen a world outside the home, and they knew that they were going to occupy that, and they had occupied that. So why go back into the house? And why is it that now my world has to be only the home? So I think protest does many things, apart from the actual issue and what is the level of success that we see in that with regard to that issue. Here, if we are talking about farmers, farmers protesting these 3 laws that have come in, irrespective of whether those laws get repealed or not, we hope it gets repealed. But irrespective of that, I think there are many other, invisible gains that happen through these protests, both in terms of women occupying public spaces, women developing a certain sense of confidence, women raising their voices, women becoming visible, women exercising their agency, and also changed gender roles and gender equations between women and the other genders. I think there are many of these invisible kind of benefits as well.
Thank you, Soumya, for that really very important statement that you have made. Nimisha, I thought I could just touch on the media aspect because it was not so highlighted. I think a very important aspect of Navkiran's work is that she provided an alternative discourse at a time when we know that mainstream media is looking to destroy this movement, And so, I mean, in the sense that, so these alternative voices, I think, are a very important resource. It could be Trolley Times, it could be other things. The anti-car movement saw so many little publications. They saw a library. There was an attempt to create new knowledge, and it was not just the Constitution, rediscovering the Constitution, but there was also an attempt to get the younger generation to actually read new things, And that is, I think, what the importance of alternative media is. And I would like to just flag that in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Soumya ma'am and Pamela ma'am for those very insightful inputs. Flavia ma'am, if you have anything, if you would like to add anything, I'd like to invite you to the stage.
Thank you very much, Nimisha. Actually, Pamela and Soumya articulated some of my own reflections regarding Kiran's presentation, and I think it was very insightful. And what is highlighted here is how almost invisibly during this protest, the gender roles can be changed or reversed, at least during the struggle, during the protest. And that is very important. But as Soumya has brought out, after the struggle, it happened also, I think, in Telangana, various other sites where women came out in large numbers. But after that period is over, a political space for women does not get created. And that is a very sad aspect of it. Like if you see women in the Telangana struggle or in the national struggle, then you are thrown back into the home saying, this is your place now. You did your role as needed for a broader cause, but now the cause is achieved or the cause is sidelined. So now you don't have a space in the public domain. And this is very disturbing. It's happened in other countries as well. So now, having highlighted these aspects, I think the task now is to preserve these gains even after the struggle. And what are the models that we need to explore, need to bring to the fore, need to adopt in order that this is not repeated. And I think that's very important, particularly in the context of the farmers' struggle today that's right now going on. One has to be very much alert that it doesn't repeat itself.
And thank you for bringing in that interesting facet of how once the movement is over, it goes back usually to the normal discourse and their normal lives, and there isn't really much change after the movement in itself or the protest in itself ends. And like moving on from this, I would like to, since we're running short of time, I would like to bring up a question that is now on a global scale, challenging feminist ideology and ideas. And since all of you brought in the concept of intersectionality and how it has entered, and of course we are locating caste and class hierarchies in that discourse, I also want you all to touch upon the recent debate about transgender women and their space in women's protests and women's movements, and how some women view it as a threat to their identity versus when it is them being a part of the versus them being a part of the movement as a whole, and we should be fighting for them as one of the most marginalized groups amongst us. Whoever would like to take the floor, feel free to unmute and start speaking. If no one, if Pamela ma'am could go first then.
Here again, I think in a sense, there is, what is interesting about the women's movement is that it is actually a crossroads movement. That's why from the women's movement, we've seen all these various branches. And it's so interesting that LGBTQ rights are actually located within the ambit of the women's movement. Why is that? That's a question we have to ask ourselves. And that is because the women's movement is, in a sense, an open-ended thing. It's not a closed system. And therefore, it allows the flourishing of different categories of people who did not see their rights reaching achievement in any form. And therefore, I think the transgender, we know that Rowling, I think, that whole row over Rowling's statement on, there is this fear that the women's movement needs to be guarded and kept a pure space for women. And I think that is absolutely the wrong way to go about it, because in a way it will destroy the movement because of what I think is its open-ended nature. And therefore, I think it is the importance of all, movements blooming, from the great seedbed that was the women's movement. I see it that way.
Right. And Navkiran, if you would like to add to that, or Soumya ma'am or Navkiran ma'am, any one of you all.
Yeah, I could just thank you, Pamela. I think, I agree with what Pamela is saying. And I think there has been this fear within the women's movements for quite some decades, because we have had struggles about sex workers movements. We have had struggles about Muslim women's movements. And there was this mainstream movement, and for all these other issues to get absorbed and accepted and to become part of the mainstream women's movements, it has taken time. And I remember attending a conference in Calcutta several years ago. I think it was one of those, I'm not sure if it was the IAWS or the other women's conference, where there was a large group of transgender women there. And there was a lot of discussion about, do we involve them? Do we not involve them? Where will they sleep? What kind of washrooms will they use? There was a lot of, but I think that's a very, very important aspect of having this discourse, having this dialogue. I think that is part of the feminist culture, definitely in India, as well as other places. I think that is important. But at the same time, like what Pamela said, there is this kind of tendency to guard the women's movements and the agenda set by maybe some people, and to say that, okay, if we include Dalit women's issues, would we be diluting the mainstream agenda of the women's movements? Similarly, if we include sex workers issues, then would the women's movement itself be told that, labeled as immoral? Or if we involve transgender women and their issues, then will the mainstream women's movements agenda, will that pale to the background? So there have been these kind of dilemmas, but I think it's a phase that that the women's movements have gone through. And it's only I think, as far as the transgender women are concerned, in my opinion, there has been far more acceptability within the women's movements. There has been adequate, recognition and space as part of the women's movements. I'm not, maybe Flavia or Pamela, who have been, there for more decades than me in the women's movement, maybe they will be able to say more about it.
I personally experienced this dilemma when we were doing this campaign for the rights of bar dancers, which was around 2004, 2005. And what we saw here is a clash between women's groups itself. Those who are supporting the right of the bar dancers to dance and earn a living and support their families, as against those fighting on the plank of morality, and that this kind of dancing will destroy society, bring down values, etc. And on both sides, there were women. In addition, there were also child rights groups who were saying that these women are induced into sex work, they're brought here without their consent, without their wish, and they are getting absorbed in sex trade. So there were all these dilemmas between us. And in fact, this law came at the instance of women belonging to the NCP party. They kept on saying that these women are evil and they will destroy the middle class Maharashtrian culture, and our women, our men are getting destroyed because they get attracted to the bars to watch these dances, immoral dancing, etc. So actually, I had written about this dilemma, how we are seeing different shades of women's movement within this struggle to support bar dancers or to oppose bar dancing. Of course, we won the case legally in the High Court as well as in the Supreme Court, but we lost it on the ground because the political parties would not let bars open for dancing because actually these women didn't matter. There were more than 60, 70,000 women, but they are a migrant population and most of them did not have a right to vote. So politically, they were insignificant. It didn't matter to any political party that they should be allowed to stay in the city and allowed to have this dignified labor of dancing and earning money. But what was the sad part of all this was one was not recognizing their own agency. What are these women saying? What are they feeling? What are the skill they possess? How this skill can be advanced? And their own self-confidence about coming to the city, finding this place as a dancing, a workspace as dancers, which would be valued in the Bollywood, in the Hindi film cinema, but not as ordinary women wanting to dance in bars and earning some money. And now if you see, most of them have, at least their children, the next generation, have gone into sex work, which nobody seems to be having an objection. But earning money in a much more dignified way seems to be the problem. Issue never got resolved. It got fizzled out in that way. And according to me, the middle class morality won. And the bar dancers, like different sexualities, using erotica to earn a living, got drowned into this and almost disappeared. And that's the very sad part of it, because in a way, as women's movement, we need to question ourselves what exactly was happening on the ground and why this division within the women's movement actually took place. So that is a very sad incident where we were not able to analytically find a solution where the dignity of the bar dancers could be retained, and not only their dignity, but their desire not to be seen as victims, but as active agents choosing a form of earning their livelihood. So this is how I think the bar dancing case actually got resolved. Now about this sex workers, there was a huge debate in Delhi, in Calcutta, various places where women's conferences were taking place, whether sex workers should be allowed to participate, whether the issues should be taken up. And Meena's issue was one of the very strong supporter of sex workers having a space within the women's movement. But here, I think, again, there were fractionism of class-wise fractionism. In fact, upper class women not wanting to mix with sex workers and the same kind of middle class morality was also there in the middle class women who were heading different forums and institutes like a women's commission, women judges. We see it in different segments where as a movement, individually, yes, a lot of women were supporting sex workers, but as a movement as a whole, like the anti-dowry movement or anti-rape movement, we never witnessed a movement for the dignity of the sex worker or for her right to work as a sex worker. It's a very, very few groups, in fact, supporting this.
Yes, thank you so much for that perspective. And Navkiran ma'am, if you would like to add anything about gatekeeping in any other arena by women's movements, please feel free to go ahead.
I guess the broader solidarities is a way ahead, and we can learn this from this farmers movement, because we all know it as farmers movement, but people across caste, class, gender, region, religion, they are part of it. And it's not like they all are raising their own issue first. but they are agree upon on a broader broader agenda. Meanwhile, they are also having their own struggles. So and also the people who we can say are not understanding yet, they will also learn while participating in the movement. I'm like, interestingly, I'm like, specifically at Tikri, we are fighting along with Khaps. And we all know, in the past years, we have like fought struggles against Khaps. But today we are sitting with them, and even they are realizing the value of this unity and the importance of like women taking part in that movement. And I hope that will go longer. I mean, the incident I mentioned, the moment when I was having dinner with these young men who were making rotis. So the moment I finished my meal and I went to wash my hands, there was an elder gentleman who was like putting water on my hands. He said, "तुम्हारे लिए तो क्रांति आ गई." I was looking at him with the like questionable face कि वो sarcastically बोल रहे हैं और like seriously बोल रहे हैं. He said, I said, why are you saying this? He said, पहले तुम महिलाएं हम लोगों को खाना खिलाती थी, अब हम मर्द तुम लोग को रोटियां बना बना के खिला रहे हैं, तुम्हारे लिए तो क्रांति आ गई. I mean, just the fact that he's recognizing what Kranti means for us is like something really important. And that's why like I'm quite hopeful that these movements is a way ahead, and these broader solidarity specifically.
Thank you so much for that like personal anecdote and the way it plays out and what you see as the vision and the future of women in protest and women dissenting and movements. And as we're nearing the end, I want to ask, as sort of a closing remark, we all know we witnessed a tidal shift in how women are taking center stage at protests now, and solidarity across borders, whether it's through the advent of social media and the ability to reach so many more people just in seconds. So we've seen Times Magazine international cover now recognizing the women at the farmers' protest. And so this epochal moment of time is now characterized by women taking to the streets. But as you all pointed out during your individual points, dissent is so much more than that. And it's individual, and it's not necessarily standing in the street every day. And it's every day in the home for most women in India. So what broader implications do you think this will have on the understanding of gender politics and fourth wave feminism? And also, as a sort of closing segment, what do each of you think women of our age can do to build on the work that you all are doing and have done, and how we can contribute to these protests, maybe if we're not near the sites, and how we move forth from here? Whichever one wants to take the floor first can go.
I guess I'm of your age. So I'm like, it's not like I have years of experience.
But you've done so much in such a limited amount of time. So how could we be more like you and like everyone else on this panel?
I guess this is a high time when we have to realize the importance of being on the roads or in the protests. So, I mean, we have to understand this, that it's not about one sect or one gender or one community or one religion. I'm like, we all have to suffer. I'm like, looking at the last 7 years, we have to now understand this, that like hamari bari bhi aayegi. So I'm like, look, just I'm like, how crucial it is for young individuals like us, because even government knew that we are the upcoming protesters, and that's why they are categorically targeting the young professionals, say Disha Ravi, Shantanu, Nikita Jacob. I'm like, they are not farmers and they are not related to farming in any way. But still, this government is targeting them because they know this is the peripheral support. or the peripheral, like the people who are on the periphery but supporting this movement. And they know, I mean, like after demolishing all the public sectors, now they are gonna target this private sector, the small companies in the private sector. And who are all the people who are working in those sectors? We are the ones. And like we are the young people who are engineers in those private companies or doctors. And like we gonna like protest in the coming days. That's why this government is categorically targeting us. So I think we have to realize the importance of like raising the voice of dissent, and we have to be on road. I'm like, it's not like we don't have dreams. It's not like I born to become an activist. I do have like uh, my own dreams, what I want to do in life. But I guess this is more important at the moment. If I don't do this now, I won't be able to pursue any of my dream. And that's the sad reality of our times. So I think that's it.
Yeah, I think it's very impactful that you made the point of you have to do it now. There's no other choice, because it has direct impact on our future and the way our lives are going to pan out. And I think it's very important for us as young individuals to remember that and keep that in mind, for everyone in the audience as well. And Soumya ma'am, if you would like to go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, about the broader implication of this moment, I think the broader implication is firstly to pass the message that women's place is everywhere. It's not just in the homes, it is in the streets, it's in the parliament, it's in the courts. It's actually reclaiming the world through women's agency. And I think in that sense, this is really an epochal movement in that regard. Also, I think it infuses a lot of gender perspective into politics, into laws, into policies. And we have seen this, right? For centuries, we have seen it not only in India, but in South Asia as well, in other parts as well, where men have thought that their experiences mirror that of the women. They have spoken for women. They have acted on behalf of women. They have made laws on our behalf, thinking that our experiences are the same. Now it is a time for women to assert their autonomy, assert their independent identity. And I see that there is a lot of potential in feminist leadership, especially during these, during these pandemic times. We have seen New Zealand, Germany, with with the leadership of women, how they have really come forward and how they have handled the pandemic. And I just remember something that the New Zealand Prime Minister said, Jacinda had said, she talked about how one can have a firm and compassionate leadership, and compassionate leadership doesn't mean that it has to be weak or a compromised leadership. I think in India, with the farm laws right now, what we really need is relooking this issue with compassion. And I think compassionate leadership is something that we really require in India. I'm also reminded of what Nivedita Menon had recently said. She said that democracy dies when its streets fall silent. So definitely, I think, it is important to be on the streets. It's important to be there protesting. I think all of us have had our share of jumping gates and protesting against the police and standing in front of the courts and demanding justice, as well as inside the courts and arguing for justice. So we have done all of this. But my message, I mean, if just going to that last question that you asked, what would be the message for the younger generation? I think protest can be in various ways. protests need not only be on the streets. Definitely being on the streets makes the protest visible, but I think it is up to each individual to decide for themselves what is the kind of protest, what is the kind of expression that they want to give to their voice of dissent. Some may be on the streets protesting, raising slogans. Some others may actually be coining those slogans. Some others may be, managing the social media and actually be doing doing the work which is not really on the forefront. I think it's left to each individual. Each person will need to decide for themselves how they want to channelize their voice of dissent, and there should not be any kind of pressure on anyone also that if you are not on the streets, then you're not a true protester. Many times, especially within student movements, if you are not agitating and if you're not doing the things that the students movement tells you to, then you're not really a protester and you're not really voicing your dissent. I think we need to have that level of flexibility and fluidity and let each person decide for themselves where their comfort level is and where is it that they want to take their revolution. A woman may be making a revolution within her kitchen or within her home. Another woman may be making a revolution in the classroom. And a third woman may be making a revolution on the streets. I think the sites of protests are multiple, and it should be left to each young person to decide for themselves where they want to be and how they want to express their voice of dissent.
I think that was a very pertinent point with regards to how student movements especially play out, because I've been part of conversations where oftentimes the discourse is surrounded on how we as young people are maybe not using social media, maybe not using Twitter or Instagram to do our activism, but I've seen people do it in the classroom, do it through their writing, and oftentimes even do it in their very homes with their parents. And it starts from there, and it starts in whatever way you want it to. So I think it's important to bear that in mind, and I'm so glad you brought that up. Pamela ma'am, if you would like to.
I would like to say something.
Yes, go.
Okay. I think a few years ago, like about 2-3 years ago, maybe things looked very dismal. And those of us who have gone through various protest sites, agitated and got certain rights enforced on the ground, felt that we were sliding back. And actually, we've gone like decades behind. And there seemed to be no hope. But suddenly, with the farmers' protest, with the CAA protest, a lot of women who had never protested, whether it is Muslim women that we're talking about, or the student movement that we're talking about, suddenly seeing that the fervor of protest and agitation was back with us. And that was very heartening to understand, because if you think that you've gone back several decades and now there is no hope at all, then you become a cynic and you feel that everything is useless. There's no point in struggling because anyway we are sliding back. But today when you see a lot of young people having so much hope, especially what Navkiran and Nimisha you are saying, your voices are so full of hope and a new vision that we thought did not exist in India anymore and was being extinguished. You can see that, you can hear the excitement in your voices. And that's what I feel is very important, at least for me personally at this moment, because that builds new dreams, that makes these dreams to come into reality. And when you're saying with so much conviction that a new dawn is possible, we are going to march ahead, whether it is in our homes, in our kitchens, in our classrooms, in the law, in the court, everywhere. We are going to stake and we are going to bring about change. In fact, one of my friend's daughter, who questioned me about like a year ago when I want to give a talk, she asked me like, "You're struggled for so many decades. What have you achieved? You wait till we grow up and see the change that we are going to bring about." And that time I was feeling very pessimistic, but I feel today what she said, that hope, that fervor that she has, it's not only her, but a whole lot of young women, students and others have it. And they're bringing it back onto the fields, into their writings, into their discourse. And I'm very happy to know that. But it's very easy to be there when there is a fervor, when there's a campaign going. But when there is a lull, then everybody like steps back. To continue to remain there and have this fervor being enacted into our everyday life, I think that's far more important. So this is just a small morning message that we cannot let go. We have to persist. We have to continue. And newer issues will come up and newer people will come in. But we have to be very persistently following these dreams. That's my message.
And thank you for bringing up that very important component of sustenance and resilience in the face of everything, and not only when it's a trend or when it's a big movement that's occupying front pages. So thank you so much, and for the faith that you have in the generations below you. And Pamela, if you would like to add any of your closing remarks.
Yes, basically, I'd like to say two things. One is the use of social media. Now, we know that social media has become the site for activism. And I worry about that because unless there is that sync between offline and online, you will not have movements that sustain. Clicktivism is not revolution. Please understand that. And I think many young people think that they can use social media in revolutionary ways. I say good luck to them, but I would also like to caution them that many have just collapsed. Many of these so-called, movements on ether, because that's what social media is all about, can just disappear, and no one knows, what they've gained from it. So that's one thing. The other thing is, and it struck me as I listened to Navkiran in her presentation, in her last observations, that we are at a stage when we are, the forces ranged against us are very formidable. Let's not forget that. It's not easy. And we know that on this rides huge capital and all the interests that it really, what we're seeing in the farmers' struggle is a struggle of people who have to actually gather their strength together. They are, powerless in many ways because the government over a period of time have removed the land on which they are standing, So, the very reason why the struggle is so important is because you see the final, effects of a majoritarian, authoritarian system and how it can denude the landscape. So these are very serious threats. We have seen, I don't like to use the word fascism because it's so facile and bandied about, but you are seeing an authoritarian, structure building up before your very eyes. And with our little Facebook posts and so on, we cannot take it on. So we need to understand the nature of the beast. And I think that is very, very important for young people today because it's their fight. We have fought various, forces over the period of time. And I'm not saying the earlier governments were better and so on. They too had their awful, aspects. But I think today we are seeing the weaponization of institutions. We are seeing the dying of institutions. You talked about the Chief Justice. Now, what does that when your last court of appeal is already compromised, you can imagine the impact that has on the struggle as such. So I think we should be aware of that. And I think, I know it's very difficult to say some of this now because a lot of it, we are already self-censoring. These new IT rules are all about censorship. They're telling us to shut up or you would, really face consequences that are very dire. The way people have been thrown into jail under the most draconian acts for nothing, absolutely nothing, indicates the intent of this government to actually finish off any opposition. So it is a long struggle. And I don't envy the future generation because they may have their Facebook, and they may have their Twitter, they may have their Instagram, they may be furiously, posting away, but their voice may be taken away from them. So that's the worry. I'm sorry to end on this rather dire note, but I think it's important to mark it.
And thank you so much for that perspective and for bringing back exactly why we are all sitting here today and the heart of this conference, and just reiterating how important this discourse is and how important going to the ground is, and just reiterating how much social media is sometimes just an endless echo chamber, usually amongst the same people who are already aware of the same things. So how important it is to initiate reform, whether it's legally, at home, on the streets. Thank you so much for that reminder, dire as it may seem, but necessary. And as this session comes to an end, before I thank you all, I just want to say that this conversation is extremely important and we would love for it to be uploaded since it's being recorded, if all of you are okay with that.
Please go ahead.
All right, thank you so much. So as we conclude this discussion, I would first personally like to thank each and every one of our esteemed panelists for their insightful perspectives, your wisdom, your work, and for the time you have given us, almost 2 hours on a Sunday. I'm sure it was not easy. And through our limited time, though we covered certain issues, there were many that remained unanswered and undiscussed. And hopefully this is just the beginning of the conversation with you and with others. And hopefully it prompts more change, more discourse, and more people to join the movements on the ground. Thank you to our audience for engaging with us and staying for the full duration. And thank you so much once again to all the organizers of the conference and to every one of you for staying and for the knowledge you have given us. It was a pleasure moderating this session. Thank you.
It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Nimisha. I think you were a fantastic moderator. So thank you for that. And also to the Human Rights Society for bringing us together on this very important conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nimisha.